So hello and welcome. Happy Friday. Today's Friday, October the 29th, and Halloween weekend is coming here in the United States where kids run around and they get all the candy that they can and everything else. This is episode number 131 of Backyard Beekeeping Questions and Answers. So what we're talking about today are questions and topics that were submitted over the past week via Facebook, YouTube channel, or filling out a form on my website, which is thewaytobee.org. So you could go there and submit your own question if you want to. There's a form. Anyway, if you want to know what we're going to talk about today, it's down in the video description below. What's going on outside? 48 degrees Fahrenheit, rained all day. Well, yesterday, the bees were still foraging and everything, and that's 9 degrees Celsius, by the way. Constant rain, more to come, lots of wind, and the bees aren't doing much foraging right now. But guess what? The cosmos, which I planted this year for the first time in the state of Pennsylvania, northeastern United States. So they're an annual flower, and I planted them in the spring, and all I did was till the soil, broadcast them by hand, and then rolled them in with a 700-pound roller. That was it. Didn't water them or anything. And you know, they are still blooming, and they are still providing pollen and nectar for the bees. And so we were out on the property yesterday while the weather was still good, and you could just hear the bees on them. And so part of that too is that the resources have dwindled so much, it's almost all that's left. The Maximilian sunflowers are gone, the asters are finished, everything's pretty much wrapped up. So if I had not planted cosmos, the bees wouldn't have anything out there right now. So what else is going on? That's pretty much it. Let's jump right into it with question number 1, which comes from Roachless. Just got my first bees today, installed them in the hives, and can see them fanning and doing orientation flights. I live in Australia, and it gets pretty hot here in summer. And I noticed the front aluminum vented bottom board on the FlowHive 2 Plus. That's a FlowHive back there. That's a FlowHive 2. And it was in direct sunlight. It did not seem to be warm to the touch. It's about 20 degrees Celsius today, which is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But I was wondering if this might be a concern when it gets warmer. It can get up to 40 C, which is 40 degrees Celsius, 104 Fahrenheit. In summer, I know you have visors in some of your hives, but is this something you've thought about? I don't want to burn the feet off my new friends. Well, those screen bottom boards on the FlowHive 2s, whether it's the FlowHive 2 Plus, FlowHive 2 Standard, those aluminum just by nature is a great conductor of heat and cold. So I think if the sun's hitting it, plus it's aluminum, it's not black aluminum. It's aluminum colored, by the way. Here's an example of black aluminum that would, when the sun hits it, of course, this thing would heat up a lot. And this is also by FlowHive, and it's their entrance reducer. So I have concerns about that when it gets in direct sunlight getting really hot. I do not have a lot of concerns about the aluminum bottom board, which is the screen that allows varroa mites and things like that to fall through, but they lose a lot of their pollen bits and things like that through it as well, and it collects in a tray down below for those of you who don't know about the FlowHives. But I'm not worried about the heat. The other thing is, you mentioned the hive visors. I'm going to put a link in here in the video description. We put hive visors, which is just a piece of wood out there. I should have, oh look, I have one right here. I knew I had one around. Now this is not an invention, by the way. This is just a practical thing. A lot of people have put some kind of shade on their hives for years, long before I ever started beekeeping, so this is not like my idea. So this is just a hive visor, piece of wood. This one happens to be made out of cedar, and we have 1/4-20 screws on them, and I'm going to put a link on how you make these yourself if you want to, if you've got a friend that's handy in carpentry. They can make them for you. They're cut at 30 degrees. This mounts right on the front of the hive, and of course this is for an 8 frame. I also have them for the standard 10 frames, and because they have screws that allow you to adjust the height as you go. And what the bees do with this, aside from the fact that in midsummer, which is when the sun is of course at its highest, so it casts shade on the front of the hive, and on hot days we found that that cooled the front of the hive and the landing board by 15 degrees. Plus it keeps rain off of your landing board, and what we're headed for is snow. So snow cakes up on top and again leaves your landing board kind of open. So these are handy. Make them yourself. You go to the hardware store and buy, 1x6s or 1x8s, whatever size you want them to be. Another advantage to using cedar is it's very lightweight, and you don't have to treat it. You don't have to put a finish on it. So that's what the hive visors are if you don't know. And I'll put a link again on how you can make your own or get somebody to make one for you. So I don't think that's a concern, but I do suggest putting some kind of awning over your landing board anyway. It just helps the bees. You don't need it. It's just a nicety for them. So let's go on to question number 2. Comes from Ink Sepons T. Anyway, I want to know if it is harmful to help a honeybee with sugar and water, since there's no flowers left for them. I have very few that were drinking sugar and water for about a week, but now is gone. Does that help, or does it even make a difference? Well, what this really, now I don't know where in the world this person is, but here in the United States, if you're in the cold climate regions, as I am, then we're backing off on feeding. But what I want you to do, though, is tilt or try to lift your beehives. See how heavy they are. And depending on the kind of stand that you have, it should be pretty obvious when you go to push on them. Don't break the joints apart or anything, but just kind of feel the weight of it. And if there's a lot of honey in there and they're really loaded up and your last inspections show that they had a lot of stores and resources, they really probably don't need any sugar syrup this time of year. So we're converting over to dry feeds going into winter for the hives that need it, or if you're putting that on just as an emergency ration just in case they might need it. So, but would it hurt? Like if you put sugar syrup out somewhere so that they can come and feed for the foragers that are cruising around, it actually, in my opinion, just my opinion on this one, if you put heavy sugar syrup out for the bees, by the way, what are they finding even on the plants? That would be considered a 1-to-1 roughly by weight, sugar and water, if they're getting nectar from the plants this time of year, like those cosmos flowers, which by the way still have a pretty good nectar yield on them. So if you're putting out sugar syrup, you're giving the foragers something to do. And usually what they do this time of year is they're going to bring that into the hive, and it's for ready consumption. Because what the bees like to do is they use the resources that are open first. It's kind of like when you go to your pantry and, you don't get a fresh bag of potato chips if you eat potato chips. You get the bags that are already open and you eat those first. Maybe a bad analogy. But bees consume the open cells of resources first. So those that are bringing nectar this time of year, I think they're going to be consuming that on their own or passing it off to bees that are inside the hive, like nurse bees and things like that, through trophallaxis. Their little tongues come out and they just transfer the resources, the nectar that they get, and that's all the sugar syrup really would be. It's considered a carbohydrate nectar source. So it's sucrose, that's all. So I think you're not hurting them if they're capable of flying and gathering and getting those resources right now. Now, inside the hive is a different story. I think it's a good idea to occupy the foragers if they're going to come out there, because you might be drawing them off of a potential robbing site. So the honeybees that would be in a colony that probably need resources are those who get it the least, because they have fewer foragers to send out. They can be attacked by really strong colonies this time of year. Hopefully those days are dwindling, and for us here in the Northeast, as the temperatures get colder, the foragers will not be pinging on and attacking those other colonies that can't fend for themselves very well. So I don't think you hurt anything by putting that out, and I think they just are going to use those resources. For those who have a light hive, I said you tip it, and if it's nice and solid, you don't need to feed them. But if you've got a very lightweight hive and you've got some concerns about the bees having stored enough resources in there, it's almost too late for that. But inside the hive, inside your hive top feeder, don't put resources on top of the outside of your hive. I also don't like the entrance feeders that you put right there because, again, robbing bees, once they locate something like that, it's an unstoppable train of theft. Once they start, you just can't stop them. They're really intense this time of year. So if you're going to feed, put it inside the hive, up in the top, or in a frame feeder if that's what you use. I don't personally use those, but you put your feeder on top inside the hive so that the bees that are resident to that hive have access to it. And you want to feed them to try to get them to gain some weight and give them some resources going into winter, because we're just about past the point of them gaining anything. You can also consider putting in what's called a winter patty. if you still got warm days. Winter patties are different from pollen patties. Winter patties are just like a solid sugar carbohydrate resource, and they don't have a lot of protein, which would kick off brood production and things like that. So when you see pollen patties and then you see winter patties, you go for the winter patties right now, because you don't want to kick off a bunch of brood production going into winter. And those winter patties are a solid form. They go right over the brood, and do that in time for them to seal up those joints again, because we don't want to be providing a bunch of leak paths, a bunch of airways on our beehives this time of year. So now we'll move on to question number 3, Susan, or Suzanne, I'm not sure. I was wondering why one would need a hive gate in winter. No insects then. Shouldn't we just pull it out for winter? There are the mice, but just a 3/8 inch opening solves that, and no danger of blocking an entrance with dead bees. Just asking. So, well, for me, and for those of you who don't know, if you've watched this at all, then this is what we're talking about. And some people are sick of this, by the way. They just think Fred's always trying to sell us something. Hate that guy when he does that. Anyway, this is a citizen science thing. So we're trying to evaluate it. That's why we're going to use it through winter. We don't even know would it benefit them or not through winter, but in theory, right? Because why would we pull it out for winter? We wouldn't, and the reason is that this is a channel of air exchange here. So the front of your hive should be sealed up now. So we don't have screens on either side of this. We've got solid entrance reducers here. So solid wood, or you've got the metal plate or something like that. Now, while we're talking about this metal plate, it goes over the hive gate here. This thing offers 0 insulation, of course. That's why I kind of lean towards going ahead and cutting your own entrance, your own opening for one of your hive gates, if you're doing that in a very cold climate, and having the wooden entrance reducer, something like this. And of course you would cut out a piece for that right in the middle so that you can accommodate this. And now we've got a 3/4 inch wooden kind of buffer zone, and this should fit snug. There should not be a big air gap on either side of it, and that's because your bees are going to use this channel to draw fresh air in or to fan air out, and maybe air will come in and out at the same time. But this is part of what we're looking at this year. We want to see what kind of condensation there might be, what kind of air movement. But here's the thing. It's one of the principles that the inventor of this was evaluating, was the air exchange, both for summer and winter. But in winter, it's actually the opposite. I think they get more control over airflow into their hive. And I think somebody else asked a question about this, so we'll be talking about it even later. But as mentioned, the entrance here is too small for mice. But if you don't have one of these, that leads me to another bit of instruction here, that you might want to reduce your entrance to 3/8 of an inch, because adult mice don't get in. I think somebody else asked about mice later on, so we'll talk about that more. But for me, because we're evaluating it, we're going to leave them in through winter on 50% of my hives. So that will let us look at it. We're going to do thermal scans and everything else, and we're going to see how efficient things are. Maybe there's a change, maybe there isn't, but how would we even know if there's a difference between a standard entrance reducer or one of these for hives that are pretty much even in every other way? Well, one of the things that we're going to look at is we're kind of guesstimating the size of the colony, how many bees are in it, how much honey they have on, and this is where your records become really important. So if this proves to be more efficient than your standard entrance reducer, then we should see less honey consumption in the hive with one of these on it, more honey consumption in the hive that allows more airflow that's not in the control of the bees. What do bees use for insulation? Other bees. And they did this in my observation hive as well. What do they do to slow down the air introduction into the hive? Well, first of all, I don't use upper entrances, I don't use any top vents, and there's no way for air to move up and out of my hives through the top anymore, because I'm following Dr. Seeley's methods, right? So that alone slows any introduction of cold air into the hive and puts it under whose control? The bees. And the bees are going to fan in air as they need it. They're going to fan it out. But the other thing is, look, they can fill this channel with the bodies of bees, and they can impede airflow if there's like a really strong storm that's blowing through there. And who are those front liners that are going to be exposed to that cold air coming in, or that wet air, that driving rain, whatever's happening? Hopefully, you've tilted your hives towards the landing boards for winter so you can shed that water. But the older bees do it. The older bees are the expendables. So they're going to be filling this up to block the airflow and things like that. And then as they get old and near death, in an ideal world, those bees are the ones that fly out and don't come back because they die outside. We don't want them to die inside. And that's the other thing. There's a little loop in here. So how am I going to check for, sorry if that made a loud noise on the recording, but I'm going to hook this thing in here. I'm going to pull out my hive gate with it. This doesn't come from that company, by the way, but guess what? It just happened to fit perfectly. So you pull this in here, you pull your hive gate out. That's if you can't see, if there's a bunch of dead bees blocking it. Shake out all the dead bees, slide it right back in. But this is a dead bee clean out tool that just happens to work perfectly for that. And we can scoop out the dead bees. So then while this is out, you reach this in through the opening and you scoop dead bees and you draw them out and you shake them out. And it has this little kind of like a scraper for your car, for your windshield. You scrape off the landing board directly in front of the entrance and you make sure that you don't have dead bees piled up in there that could plug that only egress route into your hive, which is also their airflow source, which is why you, the backyard beekeeper, and me, we need to be vigilant. We need to get out there on those cold winter mornings and make sure that airway is established. So I know I gave more than the answer to that question, but I wanted to cover the ground there. Be prepared, because I gave a couple of talks recently, and one was at the Edinburgh University, locally here to the Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association, which if you're in Northeast Ohio, Northwest PA, or Western New York, consider joining the Northwest Pennsylvania Beekeepers Association. They have breakfasts at IHOP. You get to talk with other beekeepers, and they have monthly meetings on a Saturday, which I almost never can make because I'm always working Saturdays. But join that group and we get to talk about stuff. But one of the things that people came up to me and talked to me after the presentation about was they hadn't thought about vigilantly cleaning out dead bees from their hives. So I'm going to harp on that a little bit. How often should you do it? As often as you can. It doesn't hurt. You can't over clean out the entrance because bees pile up at the entrance of the hive because it's frankly too cold outside for them to fly. They can't do cleansing flights, and that includes bees that are dying anyway that otherwise would fly out and die somewhere else. You wouldn't even see them in the hive. But on a really cold day, they can't get out. So they die right at the entrance, and they end up piling up over that entrance, and then they die there. And because we're not using upper entrances on these hives, because we're helping the bees control the warmth in the hive, they don't have another exit route. So you could be trapping your bees if you're not cleaning them out. So that's food for thought there. Question number 4. James Anderson. Frederick, can you discuss tracheal mites in a presentation? I had a bad infestation last year and only recently discovered what the problem was. Do current mite controls control trachea mites, and if so, what ones? If not, should I treat with grease patties now in late October? I used Apivar this year. I've not seen an issue this year, but I want to do all I can to get them through the winter. So tracheal mites, I know, right? If you're new to beekeeping, doesn't it just seem like there are so many problems associated with beekeeping? Isn't it so complex? Well, here's the thing. Tracheal mites, I don't get a lot of questions about them, and do you know why? Because there really aren't a lot of issues with tracheal mites anymore. Tracheal mites do just what they described. They're mites that crawl in. They're pretty disgusting. They crawl in through the spiracles of your bee at night, usually on the thorax, near the wing muscles. And they get right in there and they get into the trachea, tracheal mites. And guess what they do there? They lay eggs, they reproduce, they occupy space. They reduce your bee's ability to respirate. So now there's mites stuck in there. So now that bee, and they only do this, by the way, their target is young bees. So the old bees, forget them. The young bees, they're after them. And it definitely slows the production of the bee, it slows its ability to respirate, therefore all its other metabolic functions are reduced. And this ties into a question that somebody else had that I didn't keep in my question pile today because I'm going to cover it now. And that is when you see bees out in front of your hive on the ground, crawling around, unable to fly. And there's another thing that you'll hear people describe called K-wing. Normally your bees, their wings are nice and snug along their body unless they're actively doing something else, fanning or, something like that. But there's something called K-wing, and sometimes it'll just be one wing out to the side. Now this used to be associated with and could be an indicator for the presence of tracheal mites. And so when you see them on the ground, they're dying. They aren't functioning. They can't cope. So, and there's a test for it. We go over this when we studied diseases and, of course, parasites that attack your bees. Tracheal mites used to be a huge deal. In fact, there was a time long ago, before I was a beekeeper, that tracheal mites were the #1 parasite that was destroying honeybee colonies. It was huge. And that's why there was a lot of attention focused on diagnosing tracheal mites, looking at bee behavior, and then you have to collect them. So when you've got these sick bees in front of your hive or whatever, they're on the ground, and as described here, they were like walking away really slow. Collect a bunch of them. You can send them in for testing. So my question is for James here is, how did you know they had tracheal mites? Because it requires a microscope, not a really powerful microscope, but like a stereo dissection microscope. So I have a collection of microscopes, and I also have a procedure for examining them for tracheal mites, which involves pulling off their head and the front 2 feet and looking at the trachea underneath the microscope. And there's a whole procedure for it. It's very detailed, but you know what? I haven't done that for a long time because it's so rare now. And let me just give you an example. In the mid-'80s, there was a 45% infestation of tracheal mites among American beekeepers' hives. By 2015, it was down to 2%. So what we're talking about is an extremely rare mite in bees these days, and that's because the genetics of bees have actually improved regarding their resistance to tracheal mites. And it's kind of easy to think that that would work because if the mites were successful on certain bees and they were killing the bees, and those bees are, of course, out of the reproductive loop, and therefore the genetics start to fade off, and those bees and colonies that can handle the mites or did not succumb to mites and built a resistance and things like that, then they were the ones that prevailed, and that's the stock that you get today. So one of your treatments is to requeen with a resistant bee, so resistant line of bees. So the other thing is, part of the question here is, do current mite controls control making mites? If so, what ones? Tracheal mites. And if not, should I treat with a grease patty? Now, in late October, I use Apivar, but I'm not seeing an issue this year. I want to do all I can to get them through winter. So I'm going to give you the formula for the grease patty. And the whole point of the grease patty is the bees will eat it. It masks their scent. And that's it, because remember that the tracheal mites actually travel across the bees' bodies. They find where they're respirating, and that's why they get into those ventricles near the flight wings, flight muscles. And if they're eating these grease patties, then it masks their scent, and the tracheal mites can't find them, and the little rascals die. Aren't you sad about that? So here's the formula anyway. 1 part vegetable oil. I'm giving you a second to write that down. 3 parts powdered sugar. So you mush it all together and you work it up until it's like Play-Doh. And then you put it between a couple of pieces of wax paper. You poke little holes on it. Make it about the size of a pancake. And then you put that on your brood area. So on the backs of the frames, over the brood area. And then, of course, your bees will feed on that. And it helps defeat tracheal mites. But all the way back to the beginning question here, how did you know that you had tracheal mites? I'm very curious about that. And if you do and you can't test for them yourself, go to the Beltsville Lab website, and they do a lot of testing. And hopefully they're manned by now. I had problems getting them to test things last year, of course, due to COVID. They were all shut down. And but they'll have a procedure for how to collect your specimens, get the crawling bees, get the ones that are suspect, that have K-wing and things like that. and then they'll have a system for you to ship them out and get them tested. So that's it. But overall, this is not a huge problem, and that's why we don't hear about it too much. That's because back in the day it was a big deal, but these days, very rare. And it's like nobody spends their time examining them under the microscope. But I'm not wanting to dismiss it. Maybe it could even be making a comeback, because wintertime is when they hit. And that's sometimes when people are actually, because we're focused on the big things that are happening to the hive. So we think automatically bad queen, lost queen, dead queen, whatever. But then, of course, the Varroa destructor mite has taken the lead on getting everyone's attention. So when you look inside a hive that's a dead out, let's say, those colonies of bees that have been attacked by or killed off through winter, which is where the impact is the greatest, those bees will be dead on the frame. But if you notice, when you look at a frame, we've all, if you've been keeping bees for a few seasons, you'll pull out a frame that's a dead out, and you'll see that they've been reduced in numbers, and then they're all kind of clustered, pointing at one another, and sometimes the queen is in the center of that little cluster, and there wasn't enough bees present to continue to generate the heat they need, keep the cluster going, and everything else through winter. But there's a little tiny, like, death cluster there. Now, when trachea mites are the culprit, you'll see the bees spread out as if they weren't even cold. It's kind of like when somebody gets hypothermia and they stop shivering, they stop feeling cold, they take off their clothes and they think they're warm and they're fine, but they're dying. The bees that have these tracheal mites will spread out, and they'll fail to cluster. And so that's when you'll see a very spotty pattern of dead bees kind of spread out everywhere, but they just died of the cold and exposure, but that was brought on by, potentially, tracheal mites. So that's another indicator. So there you go, food for thought. Good question, by the way. Question number 5, Deborah Weinstein. Just wondering, after I put a mouse guard on for winter, at what point should I take it off? Does it stay on all winter or only for a short time? Thanks. Well, your mouse guard, this is where you kind of have to look at the rodents that are around in your area. One of the best areas to get rodent information, by the way, for your zone, for your area, would be your Fish and Game Department, your Wildlife Service, because they have all this information about the rodents in your area and stuff. So for me, there's 2 prime rodents that are a problem during the wintertime, but only one of them really scamps up the side of my beehives, and that's because we have video of them doing it, the deer mice. So here's the thing. Deer mice are active all winter long. So I see them running across the top of snow, and it is amazing how much ground an adult deer mouse covers in the wintertime. Because when the motion detector camera comes on, it's already halfway across the frame, a couple of big hops, and it's gone. You see its little glowy eyes. And they'll jump across the snow, and you see that thing springboard right up onto the front of a beehive. It runs up the top of the hive, down the front of the hive. These things are incredibly agile and dexterous, but they can't get into that 3/8 inch high entrance reducer. So, this question. Just wondering, after I put a mouse guard on for winter, I recommend no mouse guard. Because what else do we have to do in the wintertime? Mouse guards sometimes are, hardware cloth, 1/4 inch hardware cloth, things like that. Bees can get through it, mice can't. But if you go out there, and if you're lazy, you're not going to be able to scoop out your dead bees without pulling your mouse guard off. So that's another step, which means you're less likely to do frequent cleanouts of your dead bees. So I don't recommend the screen mouse guards. I recommend that you reduce your opening to the size that mice cannot get through. That's all. Because you know what? It's so rare, by the way, to have a mouse inside your beehives. And I don't remember if I've ever put on a hardware cloth style mouse guard. And there are other types of mouse guards too, where they're, the 1/4 inch holes. The Bee Smart swarm screen, this robbing screen that goes on there, it has a thing where it raises this up just about 3/8 inch off the bottom, and this becomes a mouse guard. But any entrance reducer that's 3/8 inch or lower is a mouse guard on its own, so you don't need the screens. So try it, see if you get a mouse in there. The only time I've had a mouse in a beehive is when the beehive is abandoned, it's sitting in a stack of other hives and it's stored. and you'll find a mouse living in there, and that's when they chew the frames and things like that. I've never had a mouse move into a hive of bees that was, occupied. And you might wonder, how else am I testing this? Well, first of all, I'm piggybacking a real genius on YouTube called Matthias Wendel. So he's the one that did all this testing about very elaborate tests on how mice are getting in and what they can and can't get into. So I have my own tests going on in my bee shed right now. I have sunflower seeds on the floor, and I have got the mice zipping in there, and the mice are feeding on the sunflower seeds all night long. And then guess what I'm going to do after that? Once they've got the source and they come, and I mean they're like coming out at regular intervals. Now the sunflower seeds will be inside a beehive on that spot, and it will have a 3/8 inch entrance reducer on it that's made out of wood, and I'll be able to video the mouse's response to see how much they try to get into that opening unobstructed, protected from the weather, in a building where the mice are perfectly comfortable and they can work on that. And I'm telling you, what they're going to have to do is chew that entrance reducer right open in order to get in there, because they know in advance they're not going to do it, but just because we need to prove it, so we need to constantly test and see what's going on. And maybe one of those smaller house mice will get in there, little gray ones, or maybe a shrew will get in there, but the shrew would be after the mice, so because they're little predators. But a shrew could probably get in it. Anyway, that's up and coming. I'm doing those tests right now, so we're going to see how that goes. Get a camera on them, and that they're very active. So that's it. We established a food source, and we're going to find out what they can get through and what they can't. But there's no time that you should remove your mouse guard, because I don't recommend that you use one. But if you do use a mouse guard and that's where your faith is, leave it on all winter long, because the mice are active all year round. And in the wintertime, especially near spring, if you start to lose a colony, if they get really weak and there's no defenders when the days warm up and things like that, they wouldn't be able to kind of sting and harass a mouse. So that's when the mice would be moving in. So I recommend, if you're using mouse guard and that's where your thought line is on protecting your hives, leave it on all winter. Now, this screen name is We're Gonna, which is interesting. I have a concern about the hive gate in winter. So again, we're talking about this piece of plastic again. So I have a concern about the hive gate in winter. Granted, I'm a wannabe beekeeper and I still have a lot to learn, but won't the hive gate direct cold air up under the cluster? Isn't that an undesirable outcome? I've never enjoyed winter air blowing up my skirt. Can't imagine the bees would either. I have my first FlowHive 2 Plus ordered, and I am drawing up plans for a long laying. I hope to embark on my bee adventure next spring, armed with all the knowledge you share. I am concerned about winter survival in horizontal and the movement of the cluster. Would using only drawn out comb. Okay, so there's different questions here, but we'll address the first one because we already covered it. If you don't have upper vents and upper entrances in your hive, you're not getting your skirt blown up. So, see, the airflow is completely in the control of your bees. They decide when fresh air comes in, and they decide when it doesn't. Now, if you've got an upper vent or an upper entrance, then yes, you're going to have a constant flow of air. It's going to come in through the entrance, and it will be coming up right under your cluster. That's why this unit is really designed for the people who are following kind of the natural thermodynamics of the beehive that the bees would choose for themselves, which is no preventing. Nothing, no airflow. The bees control airflow anytime they want it. That's how that works. So no, that's not a concern. I think it's actually going to be really good. So the next part of this is, would only using a drawn out comb, natural or synthetic, make the bees more likely to move horizontally through the hive? Bees instinctively move vertically. And remember that last winter was my first winter with a horizontal long Langstroth hive, and the bees did not make it. But there are enough people using horizontal hives in the northeastern United States in very cold areas, and the bees are shifting laterally to their resources. And where else is that information reinforced? It's reinforced when the bees are moving into abandoned buildings that are unheated and things like that. They get in the floor joists. Those floor joists provide a cavity that's horizontal, and the bee comb runs laterally through that. And then the bees migrate through that as they travel through winter. So the winter stores are the farthest from the entrance. Then as summer comes, they start backfilling and moving their brood back towards the entrance again. And that is also what happens inside your beehive. In the wintertime, they're going to migrate up if it's a vertical hive like the Langstroth, and they're going to gradually work their way up through the honeycomb. According to Dr. Leo Sherishkin, who's your horizontalhives.com guru, they move up through the comb of stored honey at a rate of 1 millimeter per day. So, the amount of honey that you have up above. So these horizontal hives, the Langstroth, kind of shallow. They're going to consume that. That's where insulation comes in. So the top of your hive, your Langstroth, your long lang, whatever kind of hive you have, the top should be insulated. Now there are, let's be honest, there's differences from beekeepers. This is a kind of a method that people assign themselves to or don't. There's a school of thought where you have to vent it, you have to get the moisture out, and that top vent is critical and they need it. And then there's another group of people like me who would say that we don't want an upper vent, we don't want that heat to be bleeding off all winter long, and we want the top of that hive to be nice and warm and toasty based on secondary heat that's released from that cluster of bees, and then down below the bees is where the moisture will accumulate that they can actually use in winter. Tom Seeley describes this very well. So anyway, you want your horizontal hives as well to be insulated on top, not vented through the top, because again, bees are very efficient at moving their own air around. They do need an entrance. They do need access to fresh air. They need to vent off their exhaust, their CO2. They need to vent off their moisture to some degree. And that can all be done through a single entrance because that's what bees have demonstrated they choose on their own. And I pay attention to people that do these rip outs from the buildings and stuff all the time. That's all I want to know. Where's the entrance? How many entrances were there? How big was the entrance? It's amazing how tiny an entrance can be for a large colony of bees occupying the space. Right now, up on top of the hill from me, I have a neighbor who has an entire colony of bees in his floor joists. He's got like a root cellar built onto the side of his house. So there's a deck up above, and the bees have moved into it, and it's just where two boards come together on the outside, so rim joists kind of. And it's the tiniest gap, just right around 1/4 of an inch in width. And so he saw honeybees coming through there, and he invited me over to check them out because he wanted to know if he needed to get them out of there. Are they okay where they are? What's going on? And they have all kinds of honeycomb in there. I put the borescope in there, the endoscope, and I looked at the bees inside, and it is amazing the infrastructure that's in there and the number of bees that are occupying that space with a single entrance that's super tiny. So the bees have shown us that without our care, without our involvement, without our modifications, they are using these spaces in the way that bees choose to use them. And any other place where there's an opportunity for air to leak out, they seal it up with propolis. We did that before when I built my feeder shims, and we put those on, and the first thing people did, because they have an integrated bottom board, and I had the feeder hole through the middle, and that was to put the rapid round on. And somebody said, well, why aren't we putting vents on there? Because it also had a wheel on the front that provided venting. That was to keep condensation away from the feed itself, not for the bees. So then I drilled 1.5-inch holes in the back, and I put number 8 screen in those holes. So now the bees would have ventilation. But if that's on throughout the year, guess what the bees did? They propolized every one of those screens, sealed up the top, and that was the conclusion for me about whether or not bees want top venting. They don't. So there we have it. Number 7, Lori Gribble. Do you reduce the entrance in, do you reduce the entrance in winter, and do you cover the bottom screen somehow on your flow hive? Well, what we're calling a screen, first of all, I don't have any of the old standard flow hives anymore. That's the original one. It had a screen bottom board with the core flute plastic inserts underneath, and we had a winter position which was up snug under that screen, and then we had a summer position which was down lower, so there was more ventilation through the screen. I don't have any true screen bottom boards on any of my flow hives. The flow hive 2s have aluminum grids on the bottom. So bees can't pass through them, but they can drop detritus and material, and that gets collected in this compartmentalized tray underneath. And you control the venting across that from the back, and it has a winter position, which is closed, not vented, and a summer position, open and vented. So you flip it over to the closed position. Now the only venting coming into the hive is through the entrance of the flow hive. I also recommend that you narrow that entrance for wintertime. And the flow hive tubes, by the way, are already too narrow for mice to get in, so you're already covered. So the screen, I don't do anything about it. For those of you who have flow hives, I know this makes a lot of people mad that really hate flow hives. But there are a lot of people that have them, and these are the questions. So the tray that's in there should be turned upside down in winter. We don't want water to accumulate in the tray. We don't want that water to risk freezing and cracking it out. The other thing is, if water accumulates in the tray, it contributes humidity to the hive, and it's out of the bee's control because they don't have access to it. So flip your trays upside down for the entire winter, and then in the spring, of course, flip them right side up again, and we can start looking for mites and things like that down there. So flip your tray, flow hive owners. Number 8, Keith Spillman. How about some info on moving hives in our backyard apiaries from a few feet to maybe 100 to 200 yards? We've all heard 3 feet, 3 mile rule, but do the entrance blocking tricks really work for moves less than 3 miles? Thank you, and see you at the Hive Life Conference. That's right. I'm going to the Hive Life Conference down in Tennessee. So that's going to be fun. Cayman Reynolds has invited me. So I get to be there and hang out with people. And we're going to talk to all those big companies that are putting out new stuff. And I'm going to walk around there with my video camera. I'm trying to talk to people and see what's new in beekeeping and meet people like you. And we're going to see what's going on down there. So the thinking is, for those of you who don't know, when you go to move your hives, if you move them just a couple feet at a time, your bees will eventually find it. But bees are incredibly stubborn, and they're also incredibly smart. For insects, bees are the biggest brained insects, by the way. So when you move something, because here's what you notice. Here's what I notice, super frustrating. Let's say, for example, kicks and giggles. Your entrance, this is a 8-frame beehive, let's say, and here's the entrance. These two entrances exist. So let's say this was the only one that was open. And let's say one night we decide we're going to close this one, and then we're going to open this one. Do you know those bees will continue to try to go to this entrance, even though here it is 3/4 of an inch away from the next entrance? They'll ultimately find their way in here. But they're such creatures of habit that they'll continue to hit that closed opening for a long time. The other thing is, recently I noticed, we're doing these feeder tests. And I put those things out, and the bees all flew to it. The foragers found it. They used the feed. And then they took off, of course. And we put the feed away overnight. And then we set out the feed, same feed, 10 feet away from that location. Do you know where the bees are looking for the feed? Took them forever to find them, forever, you know. There were still bees frantically searching the ground where the feed had been. And they did that from 8 o'clock in the morning until like 2 or 3 in the afternoon, still bees frantically searching that area. They really locked in on where that resource was. And then here we are 10 feet away with the feeders, identical feed, identical scent in the air, and the foragers have to gradually find it. So new foragers find it and lock in right away. Foragers from the day before were fixated on where it had been. They do the same thing with your beehives. They figure out where they live. They have a lot of cues for that. They look at the landscape. They look at the horizon. The horizon is extremely valuable to the bees. So the horizon line, trees, buildings, things like that. This is how they orient, as well as navigating by the sun. So now this is where they live. So they find their hive and they go to it. And now we're going to move the hive. So we have to change things around, right? So when you move it even a couple of feet, they eventually find the hive because they're within range of finding that by scent. So they visually orient, then they find things by scent, and as they land on their landing board, they know that this is home. So when you move a hive even a couple of feet, they continually go to that old spot because as foragers that were out overnight when you did your close up and you did your move, because you always close up a hive when you're moving it at night. Anyway, it's tough. You're going to lose a bunch of bees, or eventually they'll drift to other colonies, but they'll only be accepted by those other colonies if they have resources with them, nectar and or pollen. That's when they get welcomed. If they're bad foragers or there's nothing out there for them to get, they're not going to be welcomed and they're going to be rejected and possibly even killed on the landing board. So, and I know I'm taking a long way around the barn on this, but here's what you do if you're going to move your hives. Okay, so if you're going to move, like he says, 100, 200 yards, 100, 200 yards are in the same area, they're going to go back to their old location. And the question about altering the entrance, it causes your bees to do orientation flights and things like that. If you put a tree branch, you stuff a bunch of leaves in there, or you in some way alter the approach, change the direction. If it's already a southern direction before, now it faces east or something like that, and it causes your bees to reorient and off they go. But those bees will still, out of habit, come back to where that hive was. So the fix is, the best method is to pack up your entire hive, move it miles away to a friend's apiary, a friend's yard, somebody that wants to see bees for a couple of weeks, and you put your bees there, and then they definitely reorient because it's an unfamiliar landscape, it's an unfamiliar horizon, and they definitely have to know and reestablish where they live. Once you've had them there for a couple of weeks, now you can bring them back home and move them that 50 yards, 100 yards, or whatever. Some people say it even takes longer than that. But if you just have it for a couple of weeks at somebody else's house, 90% of those bees are going to now reorient when you bring them back to the new location. Because consider how long the foragers are going to be foraging, what their lifespan is, because their memories seem to be as long as their lifespan when it comes to being outside and foraging and everything else. Your brand new nurse bees and everything that have never been outside before, they're the ones that will only orient to the new location. So that's what I recommend. Take them to somebody else's yard, give them a couple of weeks there, and then bring them back. Or the dead of winter, when they're all inside. And, you've got a couple of good weeks of sub-zero weather, and they're not going to be flying and foraging or doing anything else. That's a great time to completely reorganize your beehives in your apiary. So that's another option. Question number 9. It says, Susan Tong, Bee Smart Design Inner Cover Issue. I am not in panic mode yet, however, getting close to it. My first year beekeeping has been exciting and intriguing thanks to you. Now comes the challenging part of getting the girls ready for winter in New England, New Hampshire specifically. I have 2 colonies with 2 deep boxes on each and a feeder shim, Fred style, with the substitution of acrylic versus wood for the bottom of the feeder. Those are inserts that are clear. I know I have one of those around here somewhere. Come on. Oh. This is an inner cover. It just has a piece of plexiglass in it. See that? So you can put that down. It has a vented side or it has a non-vented side. And then you can look in through the top and see what the bees are doing in there. If you want to put a feeder on there, you got to cut a hole in it. It comes without a hole. That's what we're talking about. Feeder shim Fred style. Substitute the acrylic versus wood for the bottom of the feeder shim to allow for viewing of the girls without exposing them to the elements. My husband also made an acrylic cover for the Rapid Round feeders, Blythewoods. So these Rapid Round feeders, she mentions Blythewood. That's Blythewood, Blythewood, Blythewood Bee Supply. It's a veteran-owned company. So you can check that out. Anyway, instead of the opaque covers that they come with. This allowed us, mainly him, to lift the top telescoping cover and view the girls at work. Of course, once they started bringing in their own resources, I removed the sugar syrup and put a drain stop in the 2-inch hole where the feeder sits. Worked like a charm, thanks to you. So apparently, I'm putting out some okay information sometimes. In preparation for winter, I ordered 2 Bee Smart Designs insulated inner covers in order to fit my 10-frame deeps. My husband had to remove some of the protruding plastic pegs, which I recall as you mentioned on a Q&A. The problem is, yes, these pegs, so I'm going to talk to you about this real quick so that those of you who never saw them before, these are the insulated Bee Smart Designs inner covers that just came out this year. These are the pegs on the bottom. I take a wood chisel and I knock them right off, because those are designed to hold this in place on your 10 frame or your 8 frame box, and it won't move around. But I found that just knock these off, because now they'll fit on any hive top. And the bees will glue them up with propolis anyway, so then they don't go anywhere. And they do it pretty fast. So, although this time of year it's cold, might not work. But yeah, these are the pegs we're talking about. And yes, I chip those off, because now I don't have to worry. They match up with everything. So, let's see. And remove the plastic pegs, which our calls maintain in the Q&A. And the problem is wrapped around feeders don't fit the hole in the insulated inner cover. Do I need to purchase a Bee Smart Design feeder? Bee Smart Design feeders, by the way, are those big gallon tanks. So I'm going to place hold this right here. No, you do not, excuse me, you do not have to buy the Bee Smart Design feeder. So what we're talking about here is this hole right here. And there's a cap that comes with it, and that covers this hole when it's not in use. So you see the diameter of that hole? This may not match up with your Rapid Round feeder hole, which is here. So if these holes are different in size, that really doesn't matter at all. So if this hole's bigger than that hole, you still center it over the hole, and you just set it there, and there it's parked, and there it sits. And this is like, we had this beekeeper meeting, as I mentioned. I gave this presentation at Edinburgh University, and one of the bee club members stayed afterwards and said that he had put an insulated foam board on top of this, so added to the R value, which this is supposed to be an R10, and he did a cutout for the Rapid Round feeder to center it in there, and so now we have more insulation around this area. And you know why I like that idea? So keep in mind, it's somebody else's idea, it wasn't mine, but insulation is kind of intuitive. Now the only reason that Rapid Round feeder wouldn't sit on this correctly would be if you've got the Rapid Round feeder that's got that extended center cone that actually descends below the Rapid Round feeder. So if that tube extended below the bottom here, if it didn't sit flat, now you have to put a piece of wood in there that has a 3/4 inch thickness. That's what I use. Drill an 1.5 inch hole in that wood, and then set your Rapid Round feeder on top of that. I've shown that before in another video, and it's very easy to do, and that takes care of that problem if you've got the kind with the cone that extends too far down. So anyway, this is why I'm going to use this question to talk about this issue. This insulated inner cover has these little shoulders that stick out over here. And when this sits on top of the hive below, these edges do stick out beyond the edge of the hive. So that makes a nice drip edge, which is a problem for the person posting this question today, and I'll get to that. But the other thing is it has these little raised up sections here around the edges, and that's so you can put your hive tool in there and get a nice lift off. So it's already designed to accommodate the hive tool. What I don't like, what a lot of people don't like, is that when you put your box on here, because that becomes your feeder shim area, and then I have an insulated cover on top of that, there's free airflow through this area in here over the top. So that airflow is defeated when you put a rigid foam, an additional piece of rigid foam on top of this, because now the airflow can't pass through here and it doesn't come in contact with your Rapid Round feeder, because this member of our club did a nice cutout for that. And then on top of that would go, what I use on top is a B-Max polystyrene insulated outer cover, which you have to paint to protect it from the elements and things like that. But now we have a fully encapsulated insulated cover with dry feed in it, so that your bees can get up there in winter. Because when you've got your Rapid Round on here, this channel up into the Rapid Round is open. We don't have airflow because the Rapid Round has a cover on it. But adding insulation over the top of that too, so insulation around the Rapid Round, rigid foam board, Rapid Round in place, another foam board on top of that, which is your B-Max cover. Now, we got an insulated cover there. And this sits on an 8 or 10 frame. Anyway, this is what we're talking about in this question, but I wanted to talk about that because there's a lot going on about sealing that up and eliminating airflow and things like that. So people are innovating on that. First winter with those, by the way, I have put them on every one of my Langstroth style boxes. Furthermore, the inner cover is not flush with the deep boxes and protrudes a bit over the top of the box. Is this normal? Yeah, it's on all of them, and that's a drip edge built in. So, let's see. We have come up with the configuration is basically a sleeve with 2-inch insulating foam and a telescoping outer cover to fit over the deeps, as well as the entrance versus making a 1/4-inch notch hole in the back of the solid bottom board for OA vaporization using my newly purchased ProVap 110, which, by the way, the ProVap 110, which is my preferred OAV thing, the price on that just went up. I just priced it out, and the thing is super expensive. It was expensive before. It's like $400. I think now it's $600 or $700 for that. I was not happy to see that. Anyway, so plan to vape late November, December. I monitored mite loads monthly, and the numbers went up in September as expected. Both colonies treated with Formic Pro. A lot going on here. Any input would be greatly appreciated. So that's my input. If you've got these hive wraps and they match your beehives exactly dimensionally, yeah, they're not going to wrap around the outside of this. So they'll probably have to come up against it, or you're going to have to cut little rabbits in them, little rabbit cutout so that they accommodate this. And then top again, your seal is maintained when you put an insulated cover on top of that. So I don't see that as a huge problem, but you're going to have to do some modifications, I think. And keep in mind, these things come with a vent through the top for those that want that. You just pull this out, flip it, and now it's vented from the center here because there's a little center hole right there, and the bees can go through. It's also a vent, and it's an upper entrance. Mine's flipped. I'm not using that. But you can. See, they accommodated both schools of thought. Top venting, yep, it's there. People that don't want top vents, you don't have it, don't need it. So there we go. So question number 10 from Carol Bradford, Idaho. I have an insulated hive inner outer cover for an 8 frame. What rapid round feeder fits the 1 1/4 inch hole in the insulated cover? The one I have has 1.5 inches in the bottom hole. Too large. Well, if it's just like I mentioned on the one before, if it's flush, it sits on there, and that disparity in the hole size really doesn't matter. The bees are going to use it. If it extends down through, you're going to put a 3/4 inch piece of wood in there with 1.5 inch drilled hole in it, and you're going to cover both holes and put those two things together, and you're going to create a conduit for your bees to travel through. It's really that simple. Question number 11. Michael Lusby in Maryland saw an interesting video about benefits of apple cider vinegar being used on honeybees. I provided the link below to the Hive TV's YouTube video. By the way, it's called Inside the Hive TV. The man's a very good scientist, by the way, and he produces excellent content. So if you go to Inside the Hive TV, tell him Frederick Dunn sent you. We were supposed to do a Zoom meeting together last winter, and of course my internet was so bad I couldn't do it. But that's coming up. We're going to talk, so we're going to collaborate. What are your thoughts about what was said in the video regarding spraying it on the bees to help with deformed wing virus and other issues? What about using it in sugar syrup to lower the pH? They referenced seemingly legitimate studies. Will this be okay to backyard experiment, or do you see any potential dangers using this technique as a preventative for ailments and keeping bees healthier? Okay, first of all, I did look at the video. I try to look at Inside the Hive TV whenever I can. But remember that sometimes, just like what I do here often, you have an idea, or we're talking about something that just came out or something that's being discussed. And that doesn't mean that we should jump on that and start doing it. The whole thing about apple cider vinegar and its interaction with bacteria and things like that, the science is good, but here's the thing. In this video, he said that he was talking to somebody who keeps a lot of beehives, big commercial beekeeper. And you have to listen carefully to the wording when we're talking to beekeepers and we're talking about the things that they've done and the things that they've had success with. And the beekeeper said that he sprays his bees with apple cider vinegar, and he believes it works. He believes that's the reason they do so well. So believing or feeling that something works is not enough in science. So what we need to do is you need to establish experiments. We need to have controls, which are those that are untreated. And you need to really vet out what's going on and why we think things are working. And then as a separate part of that video, he looked into the science of, on a micro level, what apple cider vinegar does to bacteria and things like that. So I would not personally recommend that you run out and spray all your bees with apple cider vinegar. First of all, apple cider vinegar is something that I add into sugar syrup and things like that when I'm trying to trap wasps, because the honeybees are repelled by it, because the apple cider vinegar is a sign of fermentation, right? So this falls in the category of things that are, it's curiosity, it's a good hypothesis. There's a lot of things that are in play there, but it requires proving out through scientific experiments and repeatability, right? So he did a great job of introducing the theory as to why that might be working, but no experiments have been done, so it needs further testing. Question number 12, Dale Orthman from New Hampshire. I would appreciate your opinion on varroa mite treatment via Ethic UB Systems heat treatment with the foundation. You have been a great influence for me. Get back into beekeeping via Layton's Hive due to bad back. Okay, so this is another one. There's a lot of companies. This is not new, by the way. The idea that we can chemically free get rid of varroa mites. It's perfect on the face of it. If all we have to do is heat up the hive, get the bees to the level where the bees are still alive and not damaged by the heat, that's key, but have the heat threshold above the surviving heat limit of the varroa destructor mite, which predates on our honeybees. The problems with that stuff is, and this falls in the category of further study required. I'm not on board with any of those companies yet. And that's because there's a lot more studying that needs to be done, and it needs to be done by people that are not selling you the product. So that's the other end of it. Everybody wants to sell that, and on the face of it, it seems cool. But if you consider how long it has to be held at that temperature, how much energy it's going to take to run the system to warm the hive, and then they have to hold it there, and the heat can't be stratified, it has to be uniform throughout the hive to kill these varroa mites. So all of that falls under the more study, more research needed, more experiments required. So because of my responsibility to you as the viewer, somebody that watches my channel or listens to my opinion about things, always step back and wait for these things to prove themselves out, and wait for other people to validate the application, the system, the way it works, and the efficacy, how effective that is, and whether or not it's damaging to brood, whether or not it's potentially damaging to the queen's reproductive system, her reproduction could be reduced, things like that. So don't spend your money yet. Wait and see. I mean, somebody may come out with one that works great, and a paper gets published on it, gets peer reviewed, and gets celebrated across the board, and this thing is the heat in the kitchen. But until that happens, I don't say it doesn't work, and I don't say that it does. I'm just saying that these things require a lot of sophistication and require extended dwell times at those temperatures in order to work. So always wait on new treatments, new technologies, and things like that, and see what the scientific community comes up with. See what people who have no vested interest in its success. So we need impartial people to look at things and to give feedback on it and do repeatable experiments to prove that it works. So that's it for today. So let's see what else here. I think, we're coming to the end of what we can really do for our bees. Everyone should have their hives buttoned up here in northern United States. If you have some resources that are out there, for me that's the cosmos, as I mentioned in the beginning, and the weather has turned, and so we kind of know where the bees are at. Some colonies are light and they're not going to gain weight. I have that hive number 7 that was holding its own. That is a very lightweight beehive. Bees and wasps were successful in robbing their resources. There's a reasonable number of bees in there and they could survive, but here's the judgment. When we have a colony of bees, keep in mind I have hive gates on 11 of my colonies. We have 21 colonies here, so it's not a huge apiary. But so now I have to think, I'm looking at those bees. We did the endoscope, we looked and saw them fight off the yellow jackets, and I had somebody out here yesterday and I was showing them, look at all the dead yellow jackets in front of this hive. They end up being a yellow jacket killer and all that stuff. But the end result was that those bees, their resources were robbed. So now I have a hive that was weighing 25, 30 pounds, which still wasn't enough. Even if they just had that, they were going to struggle through winter. Now it's lighter than that. So while they were clustered, the yellow jackets were still able to raid the outskirts beyond the cluster. So if it were a nucleus colony, because other people said things like that, Fred, why don't you put those bees in a little 5-frame nucleus colony? Then they would have had the whole space and they would have occupied it and they would have been better off. And I have to say that that's true. If they were put in a nucleus colony, they probably would have been better off than putting that swarm in a 10-frame box. So it's looking like they won't make it. Now, would you pull frames from a strong colony and give them a boost with some brood or something like that? And I say no, because what I'm doing then is I'm weakening another colony that's healthy, that's strong, that's doing well, and I'm cutting their resources, bees and resources, in order to fortify a failing tiny colony that was challenged from the beginning. So it's best to cut your losses in the fall. Hive number 7 is just not going to make it. Would have been awesome if they did, but we'll just see how things go. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for being here with me and spending your time watching this video. I hope you have a fantastic weekend and have fun celebrating Halloween. So see you next time. Thanks for watching.